Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you choose to tune in. Just know we appreciate it. This is Full Disclosure, brought to you by DiscloseRx. We are here to break down what's happening in the PBM world and bring clarity to an otherwise opaque space. I'm Chris Estep, joined with me, as always, my co-host Andy Rodriguez. Together, we are directors of business development at DiscloseRx. And on today's episode, it is a little different. We're joined by Chris Deacon, healthcare attorney, founder of VerSan Consulting, former public health plan leader, author of The Great American Healthcare Heist, and someone who has testified before Congress on the very issues employers, unions, public plans, brokers, consultants, and fiduciaries are trying to understand right now.
Chris has been in the rooms where these decisions get made. She's worked with public plans, private employers, labor groups, purchasing coalitions, and policymakers. And she's written across the major pressure points in healthcare: PBMs, carriers, hospitals, 340B, fiduciary responsibility, claims data, stop loss, and the word everyone loves to hide behind, proprietary.
So today is not just a PBM episode. It's much bigger than that, guys. This is about transparency, incentives, fiduciary responsibility, and why the people paying for healthcare so often struggle to see what is happening inside the system they fund.
Now, quick disclaimer, as always, everything you hear on this podcast reflects our personal opinions and those of our guests, not official legal, fiduciary, or procurement advice. We will be discussing public testimony, public audits, legislation, lawsuits, and industry practices, but we're not making any legal conclusions. We're here to educate and bring more clarity to a space that badly needs it.
And really, before we get started, Chris, not that it's really needed, but why don't you give everyone a quick introduction, who you are, what work you've done in this space, and how did your path take you from public service to healthcare reform, writing, and then testifying on Capitol Hill?
Thanks for the kind introduction. So I'm an attorney by training. As you said, I was in private practice unrelated to healthcare for several years before going to work for the New Jersey Attorney General's office, where I first started interacting with the health plan or health sector in some way. I then went to work for the governor's office, overseeing Department of Banking and Insurance as part of my portfolio in Department of Treasury. And that's where the state health benefits program sort of fit in the state. And so when the administrations changed over, I was kept on to run that state health plan. So we had over 800,000 members at the time, massive, multi-billion-dollar annual spend and growing. So it was really the honor of a lifetime to run that public sector plan, and the challenge of a lifetime. I was there until September of 2021 when I left. You can read about that in a recent stat article that was published. Essentially, I discovered some very, sort of untoward behavior by some of our vendors, or one in particular, raised that internally, was basically told to look the other way. And so I left and I filed a whistleblower complaint that was made public just last year. Sort of had to keep that quiet for 4 years as that case made its way through sort of the investigative process. It settled in 2025 for $100 million that was then redirected towards the state. I see it as a small slap on the wrist from a financial perspective, given the money it's at stake. But, it is meaningful nonetheless, right? There was some public accountability. So since that time, 2021, I have been in the independent consulting space. I've worked with employers directly, some of the largest unions in the country. I've done work on the Hill advocating for legislation. And as you said, I've also become a resource for, some members on Capitol Hill and committee staff on the issues that we're here to talk about, which is, transparency in healthcare and the need for more accountability and reform.
You have been very public about the fact that healthcare transparency is not a side issue. It's the foundation. That shows up across your work, from your book to your congressional testimony to your writings on the incentives and blind spots that shape healthcare purchasing. So I'd really love to start there. I mean, you've testified before Congress on healthcare affordability, transparency, and the PBM business model. You also wrote The Great American Healthcare Heist, which challenges people to look at the entire system, not just one villain or one vendor. And that is important because healthcare cost problems rarely come from one place. They usually come from layers: PBMs, carriers, hospitals, consultants, contracts, rebate, data restriction, ownership structures, and incentives that often point in different directions than the employer or patient would expect.
Chris, you've testified before Congress and written extensively about healthcare transparency. When you're sitting in front of lawmakers, what do you wish they'd understood better about how healthcare is actually purchased and paid for?
That's a great question. I think, they come to the table with varying levels of sophistication and education. And unfortunately, a lot of that education when you are on the Hill is coming from the industry because, it is somewhat of a revolving door of industry professionals. If I were to leave them, if I were to reach everybody and leave them with one nugget, it would focus on the information asymmetry, right? I think that there is an assumption that employers come to the bargaining table with, a counterparty, say a PBM or a carrier or some other vendor, as an equal player in that negotiation and contracting process. But and I know that, employers don't get to redline contracts and ask for things that, that they are owed. Oftentimes the carrier or the PBM, this is the contract, this is our boilerplate, we do not deviate from this, sign it or your members are going to lose their health care, right? So there is an unequal sort of bargaining power there, especially with market concentration. So just focusing on understanding that process and the information asymmetry that exists because of a lack of transparency.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Important to know what's in the contract. A lot of healthcare debates try to find one villain, but your work points towards something more structural: incentives, contracts, data restrictions, ownership arrangements, and business models that are hard to see from the outside. Why is transparency the starting point for understanding the system without oversimplifying it?
Yeah, I think in healthcare, it really is as simple as, following the money. We need transparency in order to be able to follow the money. I know healthcare is incredibly complex. I am not here to tell you that it's not. However, what I do believe is that you give me any, sort of complex issue in healthcare or problem that we have identified as an industry. And if you follow the money, we can tell you why that problem exists, right? And probably how it could be fixed. It might, impact somebody's revenue or bottom line, but it really is as simple as that, is following the money, and transparency is going to allow you to do that.
You heard it first, ladies and gentlemen, follow the money. Now, I want to do a quick little plug. Your book is called The Great American Healthcare Heist. For all the listeners out there, go grab yourself a copy. It's phenomenal. Chris, this is not exactly a soft title. When you use the word heist, what are you trying to get people to understand about the system?
Yeah, so if you actually look up the definition of heist or, understand heist in the context of, let's say, a robbery, it's a coordinated effort by multiple parties who each have their own role to play in the heist, right? You have the getaway driver, you have the folks who have staked out the place, you have the actual people that are engaging in the heist. But it requires sort of this orchestrated event to occur, and that's how the heist happens. And by the time you realize what is going on with all of these multiple players, the heist is behind you. You've lost, right? The piece of artwork is gone, right? The money's left the bank. And so I think it was really apropos here because there are a number of players. They all have a role to play. I think by and large, despite a lot of the bravado in the public domain about, pharma versus PBMs and hospitals versus carriers, at the end of the day, they all benefit when prices and costs go up, by and large, when that, $5 trillion healthcare pie gets bigger. And so I think that's what the heist is.
First of all, outstanding analogy. Thank you for explaining that. I love it. I'm going to use that from here on out. You've written about PBMs, carriers, hospitals, 340B, stop loss, and claims administration. Of everything that you've written, Chris, which topic do you think made people the most uncomfortable and why?
Hospitals, right? I think that hospitals make people the most uncomfortable because it is easy to villainize an insurance company, right? It's easy to villainize certainly a PBM in today's political environment, at least the big three. And it's easy to villainize pharma when you see how much money they are, or what they're setting prices on for drugs that people need to live.
Right.
But I think hospitals are particularly uncomfortable because they put themselves out, sort of as the bastions of the community and the the anchor employer and the charitable entities as they are, like Ascension, one of my favorite hospitals to pick on. They literally invoke ministry and service, and using the term like Jesus Christ in some of their marketing materials, right? Because they hold that religious tone out. Like, that's just an example of why I think it makes people uncomfortable to understand just how bad and just how greedy some of these hospital systems are. I think it's doubly uncomfortable because it is difficult to sort of slam or criticize an entity that you might have to take your child to tomorrow, right? So I think it's important to separate out the sort of the clinicians and the caregivers within the four walls of the hospital or hospital system, and sort of that administrative layer that sits around them. I think that that's helpful in being able to talk about it more comfortably, but it is uncomfortable. And I do think that the tone is changing, though, in the public domain.
And I would agree, for sure. Well said. One of the reasons your work lands is because you connect policy to real life plan decisions. That's not just what happens in Washington. This is what shows up in an employer renewal, a union health plan, a school district budget, or a family premium. And that brings us to fiduciary responsibility. Employers are being told that they are fiduciaries, but then they're responsible for acting prudently, monitoring vendors, understanding plan costs, and making decisions in the best interest of members. But in practice, Chris, many employers are still fighting for access to contracts, claims data, rebate detail, pricing terms, downstream vendor information, and the full picture of how money moves through the plan. That's where the CAA 2026 becomes important. And Chris, you've written about a deeper issue inside the covered service provider framework and why the industry may need to focus less on what a vendor calls itself and more on what function that vendor actually performs for the plan.
Yeah, Chris, and in preparing for this episode, one of your writings that I had read, you had written that fiduciary responsibility remained intact, but transparency did not. So can you kind of explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's interesting that over the last 5 years, I would certainly say 5 years, the F word has become really front and center of everybody's, discussions. This new fiduciary responsibility, this new fiduciary, angle and lens. Folks, fiduciary obligations have been around since the inception of ERISA and group health plans. You've always had it. I think now we're just, entering sort of a new era where, when met with some transparency, you now have information that, know better. Now you have to do better. So I think there's a new awareness of that fiduciary responsibility and certainly an understanding of what that means. Andy, you just sort of laid out what the principles are. But again, without transparency, it is very difficult for employers to actually fulfill any of those principles, right? How do you understand reasonable plan expenses if you are not able to see what your expenses are, right? In sort of a detailed broken down way. So I think transparency and that information has to catch up with the fiduciary awareness. But I'll pause here to say that we're using this word transparency, I think, as an industry very loosely. And I actually wrote on LinkedIn today about this, right? I guarantee you, and I could pull it up, AHA, Pharma's Trade Group, Carrier, AHIP, all of the industry sort of lobbying groups have put out statements. We are firm supporters of transparency, right? Transparency is super important and we are committed to transparency. But, right? And the caveat is basically, if you're to decipher it, not at the expense of our bottom line, right? Just not far enough, just within the boundaries that we set for it. Right. Transparency has also become sort of a buzzword for entities that want to put themselves out there, from a sales and marketing perspective. I think there actually are transparent organizations that, fulfill that word to its fullest extent. And then I think there are organizations that have no problem putting the word transparency in a really, slick, glossy deck for their sales pitch. So again, I think it's worth sort of just pausing and making sure that, when I say transparency, it's not a machine readable file that nobody can read, right? Or a file that's been put up that is indecipherable because of the format that they've used. True transparency, again, is really seeing the financial flow. If you can follow the money, you have some transparency.
Yeah, quite frankly, I'm tired of seeing the word transparency, and I'm glad, you broke that down for folks. I mean, even we're a PBM, when we hate that word transparency because everybody and their distant relatives twice removed are using transparency. It is ridiculous. And looking at PBMs, I mean, CAA 2026 has been talked about mostly as a PBM reform. But you have described one part of it as a sleeper issue. What is being missed in the conversation?
So I think, most are looking at the CAA 2026 as a PBM issue. But the sleeper cell, so to speak, is the expansion of covered service provider and the disclosures required under 408B2. So to sort of level set, CAA of 2021 had 408B2 disclosure requirements for broker consultants, meaning that they had to disclose direct and indirect compensation over $1,000 that was derived as a result of the health plan's business. And, for the last 5 years, there's been a tension and a disagreement, let's say, over who does that apply to, right? And the CAA of 2026 really sort of makes clear that covered service provider definition that has to disclose direct and indirect compensation is intended to capture some of those, third-party service vendors. Because we know that there's money flowing between broker consultants and carriers and PBMs and, point solutions. We know that that's happening, but we don't know at a sort of granular level what's happening to us as employers. We'll see how it pans out. I mean, it's still early days of what the reporting looks like. But yeah, I think that was a pretty significant change.
Yeah, it's the part that, nobody's really paying attention to. You see the headlines about PBMs. Get on LinkedIn. It's every other post is about how CAA is going to fix PBMs. And I almost feel like it's a shield people are using that don't want people to look at the other fine print of the CAA.
Right. Well, if it were you, would you be advertising that? I mean, yeah, if from an industry perspective, I think there's a reason why the flashlight's sort of being shown in one direction. It's highly self-serving, and I think that that's a broader theme, and I point this out in the book. Is there's lots of finger pointing between, let's say, pharma and PBMs and hospitals and carriers. But at the end of the day, like, they're pointing the fingers at each other. There's enough blame to go around, but nobody's actually saying, like, what about, the actual purchaser, the patient, the employer, the union, the American worker, the taxpayer, right? It's fine if you guys want to figure out who amongst you is most to blame, or what percentage of blame you deserve. But at the end of the day, it's all at the expense of, that group that I just mentioned. And nobody really sort of talks about that. At least, not until very recently.
Yeah, it's a really crazy world. I mean, I saw I was at a conference, and I brought this up in a previous episode, but I just love the quote where he's the gentleman that said that there's not really any legislation that's going to fix these issues. It's the people who are a part of it that have to fix it. That's the purchasers, that's the consultants, that's the vendors. I mean, it has to just come from an outside source. Legislation helps, gives you a framework, but if you're just figuring out ways around it, it's just going to keep this cycle going on and on and on. A question we have here for you is the shift here that ERISA starts caring less about labels and more about function? In other words, not really what you call yourself, but what you actually do for the plan.
Yeah, I think that some of the case law or cases that have been recently decided are definitely leaning in that direction. So without boring and your listeners to death with sort of the legal angle here, but there was a really important case out of the Sixth Circuit called the Tiara Yachts case, and it involved Blue Cross Blue Shield and Tiara Yachts, and as a company, as an employer. And, essentially what the court says, or the principle that they espouse is, it doesn't matter what you call yourself in the contract. If you are acting with such discretion that over an employer's money that you're able to essentially set your own compensation, you are a functional fiduciary, and you have to then act as such. And the fact pattern there, I think, is really important because it is pervasive across the industry, is essentially, as their TPA carrier, they were paying claims on behalf of the employer, right? But they found out they were making a sort of a systemic error in paying a certain subset of claims. And they found out that systemic error was costing their employers, I think it was around $27 million annually. And it was actually a whistleblower that brought this to light internally, who was fired. When they learned about this, rather than fixing the mistake, they monetized it. And they did that by saying, well, let's fix the mistake, claim by claim. That way we can take a shared savings fee on top of it. So we get to keep 30%. So essentially, they're able to set their own compensation. And, depending on the volume, sort of, they know that is incorrect out the door, what they're able to recapture at 30%, they're now sort of in control of their own destiny when it comes to how much they want to make off that account. And that is pervasive across, every major carrier. I have yet to encounter one. I've had some that might cap their fees, but they figure ways around it. But again, in that situation, they had disclaimed fiduciary status in their contract, but the court said, no. Essentially, if you're acting with this much discretion over somebody else's money, you're doing so in a fiduciary capacity. And so the case went back to the district court, and now they're fighting about discovery and data, of all things. But we'll see how the case shakes out. I wouldn't be surprised if it's settled before more becomes public.
Oh my Lord. We talked about transparency being a buzzword in this space. Settling. I mean, anytime you see a lawsuit, settlement, settlement, settlement. Oh my Lord. At some point, we should put a stop to some settlements and just say, no, let it play out. I mean, I really want to see Tyson versus Ali, right? I want to see what actually happens here. Is anything going to take place? Because it's a penny in the bucket to a lot of these vendors, what they pay out. It's like, oh, wow, $10 million. That's nothing to a
Right.
lot of these folks.
Well, and I think unfortunately, when it's an individual employer having to take on sort of the David versus Goliath, if Goliath can, give you so much money that essentially everything you're asking for has been covered, you really, well, certainly your attorney has an ethical obligation to advise you to take it, right? And as a plan fiduciary, right? If this is an amazing deal and you have to roll the dice if you're going to continue and go forward to trial, as a fiduciary, I have an obligation to do what's right for my plan, not necessarily what's right for the industry. So I get it. That's why we need DOL to get more active and some other public players that could, conceivably carry a case out, where the settlement terms or, something is actually going where we get discovery and maybe even to trial.
We need that one stubborn person. So let's just I'm gonna do it. Let's roll with it. So how should employers think about covered service providers in a modern health plan where so many services are layered through carriers, PBMs, TPAs, vendors, tool platforms, panels, and other arrangements, just like a bad lasagna?
Right. So I always start from the premise and suggest that employers start from the premise that there are financial flows between vendors that come across your desk. What do I mean by that? Like, if your broker brings a point solution to you and says you should really consider this add-on to your plan for next year, the question shouldn't be, do you think that there's money being exchanged behind the scenes? Is there what? No, the assumption is there is, right? So when you ask the question, I would like to know what the arrangement is and how you're being compensated. Is it on a PEPM basis? Is it on a per claim basis? Do you have a corporate agreement that sort of isn't allocable to our plan, but is part of your overall, right? Assume that it's happening and just ask about the structure because they really puts them on, they can't just say like, I don't know, because you are assuming that the answer is yes. Now the burden of proof has shifted, right? Now they have to show me that they're not, as opposed to me having to prove that they are. I think that's a really strong tactic that I would suggest to employers. I think, and just that, yeah, just that awareness that, make that assumption and then make them prove otherwise. The other thing I'll say, and this goes back a little bit to our transparent point, there's one of the large PBMs was presenting to as a finalist, and they're offering their transparent sort of cost plus model, right? Everybody wants transparency. So, we, the big PBM, have decided to get on that train, and we are the biggest supporters of transparency. So we're going to offer you this service, and it's going to be purely cost plus, and you'll know exactly what you're paying. And the question that I asked back is, fantastic, right? We're glad you're moving to a cost plus model. How are you going, not will you, but how will you report to the client on affiliate revenue? We know that you own the GPO. We know that you own the specialty. We know that you own the mail pharmacy. And we know that you own, the white labeling manufacturers abroad. How will a client now be able to know how much affiliate revenue is being driven by their business since you've now moved to a cost plus model, right? Crickets, by the way, to that question.
Of course.
But there are questions that need asking, and sometimes crickets are your answer.
Yeah, I think, and I love the whole prove me wrong approach. If you can't prove me wrong, then I know I'm right in this situation. And it's so evident in this space. It is just absolutely just mind boggling when you really look at it. And you have said before that transparency creates friction. but not always because of law. Sometimes the friction is economic. Why does transparency become so disruptive in a system where existing business models are already working for the entities inside the system?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a Stacy Richter quote, where there's mystery, there's margin, right? And that is incredibly true in healthcare. Um, when, when I can see through my claims data that you've been juicing my shared savings by paying claims inappropriately, well, that's a very uncomfortable conversation to have, right? With your partner that's been your carrier for 20 years, right? Um, and, again, sort of the friction internally, um, we now see, who the players are that are leading to those increased costs, right? It isn't just the carrier, like it's also the fact that the hospitals are now, charging X, Y, or Z, or putting on modifiers or unbundling or whatever it is. Yeah, it's going to be a really, really uncomfortable like time for the industry and for these vendors who've never had to answer for any of this stuff. But uncomfortable conversations is where positive growth happens. If you go into a renewal meeting or a finalist meeting or, any sort of meeting where you're across this table from your vendor, like it is your job to push them to do better. And, I've had this experience with some brokers that I've worked with, being brought in by an employer to sort of maybe oversee an RFP process for a consultant or a TPA and sort of keep the consultant broker in check. It's uncomfortable, right? Because I push them to do better for the client because I push them with uncomfortable questions. I ask them about their compensation that they're getting from vendor X, Y, or Z in front of, the client. But at the end of the day, the result is a more transparent relationship, a better financial outcome, and probably they're going to, trust that consultant more because of that transparency. So, yeah, I think, through that friction comes growth in the
I
right
mean,
way.
absolutely. I mean, uncomfortable conversations are not always a bad thing. They start off uncomfortable, but at the end of the day, everyone's back on the same page. I think that's important just in life and also within this space. And
Well,
then if
I
go ahead.
I would say that walking away from the table still uncomfortable is going to be the result for a lot of folks too, and that's also okay.
Yeah, absolutely. You may not always get the answers you want, but you know what? At least you have an answer. Um, and if an employer wants to build a stronger fiduciary process, what should they be documenting beyond just the renewal spreadsheet, and what should be easy to explain later if that discussion is ever reviewed?
Yeah, so I, as a former government employee, am a big fan of document, 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 right? If I'm having a conversation with you and we've come, to a meeting of the minds on certain terms or path forward or next steps and action items, the next thing I'm doing is I'm sitting down at my computer and I'm writing a memo to the file, right, to myself, or I'm documenting it in an email to you, so that I have that paper trail. Oftentimes, that sales presentation or that the commitment from the sales side of a team, yeah, we'll be able to do that for you. We'll be able to make an exception for you, like if to earn your business. But then when it comes down to it 6 months later, maybe they weren't able to make that commitment because it can happen. Make sure you get everything in writing up front. And yeah, so document, document, document. Um, but also understand that this is not a box checking exercise, right? It is not, did I file my 408b2? Did I form a committee that had lunch? Did I, it has to be meaningful. Because again, I think engaging in these processes, it's not just risk mitigation from a legal perspective so that you don't get sued, right, by your employees for breach of fiduciary duty. I guarantee you, if you actually stick to those principles and, do what they require of you, you will absolutely save your plan money and provide a better benefit for your members for the value.
Absolutely. Yeah. Documentation. I mean, Andy and we worked with a boss who always said if it's not documented, it didn't happen. He said that ad nauseum. Now it plays into this into this space. Shout out our former boss. But I'd love to move from policy into just some of your specific writings. I mean, you have written about some of the biggest blind spots in employer-sponsored healthcare because what makes your work powerful is that it does not stay theoretical. You connect audits, lawsuits, policy proposals, and contract structures back to the practical question employers keep asking: what does this mean for the people paying the bill? So rather than making this just about one issue, we want to give you room to walk through the stories and writings that matter most.
Chris, you've written a lot over the last year. If someone were to ask you which three pieces best explain what's broken in healthcare purchasing right now, which ones would you point them to?
I would definitely point them to any of my writings on shared savings programs.
Mm.
So, one of the reasons this is so important is because these programs have massively expanded. And again, without claims data and real-time access to claims data, it's very much like trust us and no, you don't get to verify, which is a problem. Writing on the importance of claims data, I think is key. And some of the very practical steps that you can take to understand claims data and how you can work with it in your office on day one. And that can even be from sort of high level reports. Like there are things employers can do tomorrow, to actually effectuate change. So I would definitely point them there. And then I think this is not a sleeper cell, but like an area that is not talked about enough. And this is the financial transaction side of employer-sponsored healthcare. So what do I mean by that? Today, most employers are funding, an account and or funding directly to a carrier who then is paying claims out of their own account, right? They're taking your money, you get some sort of information or a number, whatever that you're supposed to fund claims at. They're taking that money and then they're funding claims. I think the more employers get control of the purse, right? Eventually, I want to get us to a day where it is coming out of the employer's financial institution and they're actually paying claims. I mean, nothing else has to change up top, right? There's no reason that dollar has to come from a carrier's account versus an employer's account. It's the same banking instructions. It's the same payment instructions. Why is that necessary, right? Well, it's necessary because they don't want you to know when that money's coming out, in what amount it's coming out, and who it's going to. So I have written about that, and I would say that's more on the solution side than, problem pointing side, but I think it's really important.
It's a solid point. I mean, the recurring theme is follow the money, but then when you allow the employer to have control over the purse as you stay, that's literally everything. So a lot more eyes wide open in that space. I think it's a really good point.